So I think we're nearly at the start time for my session. My name is Sue Leshan. I'm just going to give you a few minutes, those of you who are attending, to get logged in, seated, settle down, comfortable. And then we will kick off with my talk on legal interpreting, warts and all, by one who knows. So it'd be interesting to see in the chat where you're from and where you're logging in from. So I think we'll have a pretty international audience. We certainly have in recent years. I'm currently talking to you from Romania, where, believe it or not, where I'm attending a conference, an interpreters conference, the International Association of Professional Translators and Interpreters. So I think you should all be ready by now. So if you're all sitting comfortably, we will start this session. So I'm presenting to you on legal interpreting, warts and all, so the good and the bad, about legal interpreting. A little bit of information about me. I am a qualified lawyer in the UK, although no longer practicing. I have a law degree, which is an LLB, and a social studies degree, a BA, Bachelor in Arts. And this next bit of information should be of interest to those of you who are interested in doing legal interpreting as a career. I'm a member of the National Register of Public Service Interpreters, the NRPSI, also of the Association of Police and Court Interpreters, APCI, and also of the Association of Interpreters and Translators, AIT. And if you're looking for a career in legal interpreting, certainly in the UK, I would strongly advise joining all of those, because they all have registers of interpreters. So when clients are looking for legal interpreters, they will search those registers. Also, they're very, very useful in terms of your marketing generally, making known on your website that you are very professional, that you have all these professional memberships as well, just might make the difference between you being selected for a job and somebody else without those kind of memberships being overlooked. I'm also a member in the UK of the Institute of Translation and Interpreting, the ITI, and also of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, the CIOL. And I am an active member of the Chartered Institute of Linguists Interpreting Division Steering Group. I have what's known as Chartered Linguist Interpreter status because I have carried out a lot of continuing professional development over the years. It is so important, if you are intending to be a legal interpreter, to do law-specific CPD. You really need to do this because law, as you can imagine, is an ever-changing subject. We can really get found out if we don't keep up to date with legal changes. It could cause a lot of mistakes. I describe myself in my marketing actually as a lawyer linguist because I'm dual qualified, and that definitely does bring in a lot of work, that description. I have my own company in Manchester, UK, which is known as Avocate, which means woman lawyer. So I thought that was quite appropriate. And I specialize in legal and also business French interpreting and translation. In the UK, I also mentor for the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting Law exam on a one-to-one basis. So do contact me if you're interested in help. Or generally with any help for legal terminology that you might be in need of for any sort of legal interpreting assignments or legal exams or whatever. And I'm also a business guru for new and existing language professionals. So what actually is legal translation and interpreting? it means a lot of things, really. But I think first things first, you really need to start thinking like a lawyer. And it's not that easy if you aren't a lawyer. But to help things along, I've given you an example here. The cat sat on the mat. I'm sure we're all familiar with that phrase. Or the lawyer will want to know which cat and why was it sitting on the mat and which mat. You know, that's the kind of mindset that you really need to get into. What is actually a legal job? And this question is really important because you may well be offered jobs that aren't actually strictly legal, and you need to know why they're not. For example, you may be offered by an agency what is a so-called legal job, and for interpreters or translators, and actually it isn't. If you have a close look at it, it might be a financial job. For example, you know, you might have some quite difficult terminology in it, and I mean financial terminology. Who amongst you, for example, could tell me what is the difference between these phrases: the tax year, the financial year, the fiscal year, or the accounting year? And they all do mean different things. And financial translators are very, very specialized, and they would be able to immediately distinguish between all this terminology, but legal translators not necessarily so. And what can happen actually is agencies can offer you so-called legal jobs. They don't actually realize, because they haven't even looked at them, you know, themselves, that it's a financial job. So just be wary of that. Legal assignments clearly have terminology issues involved. And in this slide, you can see the terms contract and also agreement. And there is actually a legal difference between contract and agreement. For a contract to exist, that all the elements, legal elements to make up a contract, have to be present. An agreement might not necessarily be a contract. So, you know, this is where, again, I can't emphasize enough that if you want to be a legal interpreter or translator, or both, as in my case, you really need to be very clued up on your legal terminology. Notice in this slide also this quite old-fashioned terminology, witnesseth, you know, sort of in witness. So you will come across this kind of really quite ancient terminology from time to time, which again, you need to be familiar with. So really some tips here about helping you to decide what is and isn't a legal job. Never accept a job blind, you know, without actually looking at it before you decide whether or not to accept it. Just because the client, whether it's an agency or a direct client, tells you it's a legal job, you know, don't take it on trust necessarily that it is. Even if they just say, okay, I'll send you a sample of the translation, so you can make your mind up. A sample isn't enough, because the sample might be not representative of the whole. It might just be the easy bit, or perhaps the difficult bit. How do you know if the rest of the translation is manageable from your competence point of view? You don't. Don't actually assume that the client has actually read the text that they're giving you, the so-called legal text. They may well not have. They're just quickly trying to allocate jobs. Don't even assume that if they have read it, that they've actually understood it. You know, I've had situations where I've been offered so-called, shall we say, insurance contracts to translate, and actually they've not been insurance contracts at all. They've been reinsurance contracts, which is different. And you might get situations where clients and or project managers might say that what they're giving you is a legal job, or, you know, interpreting or text. They tell you, oh, it's all about marketing trends for lawyers' services. You know, they might say the job's all about interpreting as to how lawyers market their services in France or whatever. That may not be strictly a legal job. It's much more a marketing job, really. with marketing terminology, all about trends and predictions and all that kind of terminology. So just be wary on that kind of differential as well. You might get a blind offer, in other words, an offer of a job you haven't seen, where it's a so-called legal translation assignment. And when I say you haven't seen it, you have up to a point, because the client sent you a document, and you know we still occasionally do have to translate and do oral interpretations in court, sometimes on handwritten documents, and actually the document might be illegible, like the one in this slide. So make sure that you can actually read the document before you take on the job. Being careful still about accepting legal, so-called legal jobs. You know, it might be, for example, an interpreting assignment about so-called property, all to do with buying property for the sake of argument in India, shall we say, from a legal perspective. And you might think, oh yeah, great, you know, I'll take that job on. But, you know, unless you really understand the legal system for buying and selling property in India, you might well come seriously unstuck. Personally, you know, I wouldn't touch such a job, because my whole background knowledge about buying and selling property is based on, because of my language being French, the legal system in both England and in France. Outside of that, I just wouldn't be competent. You might be given a document to translate, or orally or in writing, and you may well be told by the client that it's a contract. But as I say, you know, what you actually get may not be a contract. And again, you need to know the elements that make up a legal contract. Just because the document says it's a contract, it might not be. It might be a promise, but it lacks the other, you know, the promise to do something like, for example, to cut your neighbour's lawn, but without any sort of financial element. You know, it's just an act of kindness. It might not be actually a contract. So just be very careful about terminology that you're using. You can see where I'm heading with this. As I say, samples can be provided by some clients. You know, they just give you maybe the first page or the last page to have a look at. They might seem quite manageable at the time, but don't assume that the remainder of them that you haven't seen are within your legal and or linguistic competence. So you need to check out the whole document before accepting the job offer. And I would strongly advise you to reject the offer if you're not able to see the whole document in advance. And you can see that where I'm coming from is very much a kind of lawyer's perspective of, you know, eliminating all kind of possible risk when you're being offered so-called legal jobs. The job may not be exclusively legal. For example, you might be offered a medico-legal personal injury case, you know, where a client has been injured, for example, here in a skiing accident, and they've got a claim now for compensation against the ski school. So what you're going to get in this example, in this job, is a report about injury. So there's going to be a lot of sometimes really heavy duty medical terminology about the broken fibula or tibia or whatever, and the treatments that were given, the operations involved, and so on. And then also sections of the document or other additional documents relating to the legal claim that's been put into court, or a settlement or whatever. So what I find, if I get this kind of document, I'm much slower on, you know, doing the sort of medical stuff than I am on the legal stuff. For example, in court, I'm quite often asked to interpret on personal injury cases or cases to do with assault. And very often you'll get a lot of medical evidence. Some of it in a recent case was extremely difficult. It was all to do with injuries to the eye. and the eye specialist was producing a lot of reports and diagrams about the inner workings of the eye. And frankly, if I hadn't prepared all of that beforehand, I would have been a goner in the actual interpreting session in court. It would have been virtually impossible for me. What about your competence in non-legal areas? You know, you may well be very competent in your legal knowledge, skills, but not your medical, or vice versa. And I think we all need to sort of acknowledge our strengths and weaknesses here. And if you are lacking in one area, you're going to slow yourself down. Like I've just said to you, you know, if I do any sort of medical stuff in with my legal stuff, it will really slow me down. And also, if you have a lack of competence in any area related to your legal skills, you know, you find that you might find that you get complaints, even of the professional misconduct variety, can cause reputational damage as well. So obviously, if you're in the legal field, you know, this is a very litigious area generally, not just for lawyers and clients, but for anybody else, like professionals like ourselves involved in it. We're working with people who know all about suing and so on, and compensation. So just be very aware of that. If you're in doubt about accepting any kind of legal job, do consider our professional codes of conduct and the clauses all to do with competence. So rule of thumb really should be, if you're not sure about your competence, just don't take a job on. Practical exercise, really, and I'd be interested to see your answers in the chat on this. You could consider, of course, sharing a job which is not exclusively legal with a colleague who is competent in the other area, whether it's medical or could be to do with geography or technical skills. And how would you do this? And what sort of factors would you take into account? And what kind of arrangements would you make? And why might you not want to do this job with somebody else, basically? So here's working as a legal interpreter or translator with a colleague or more than one colleague. So put your answers into the chat, please, on that one. So if the job isn't exclusively legal and you're sharing it with a colleague who's competent in that area, you can always, or you want to share it with a colleague, check out the colleague on various professional registers, such as the Chartered Institute of Linguists Find a Linguist page, where a lot of us have got our profiles for clients to find us. If you are thinking of sharing a job or any kind of information about legal interpreting jobs or legal translation jobs, make sure that you get your clients, and I would certainly advise written permission first before you maybe breach their confidentiality. I mean, do bear in mind a lot of legal interpreting and translation jobs are, mired in confidentiality. We're very often asked, aren't we, to sign non-disclosure agreements about confidentiality before they will even send us any documents, or which we might need to prepare up front and so on. Sometimes, of course, the confidentiality issue can be a real problem for us with legal work, because you will get clients, maybe they're lawyers or insurance companies, whatever, who want to book us, saying, oh, because of confidentiality, I'm not willing to disclose material to you. It might get lost or whatever. And, until you arrive at the court, you might only know the name of the case and vaguely that it's to do with a murder, for example. Well, that's not really okay, to arrive cold like that. So you really have to work hard, in my opinion, to try and, get material up front because of the legal terminology involved and so on. Also, do think about if you're working with a colleague in legal translation, getting a colleague to sign your non-disclosure agreement, create one for that colleague, and your terms and conditions as well. Otherwise, you could be putting yourself seriously at risk here. And get any written work, any written legal work that you do independently proofread, to ensure consistency if it's a shared translation. If your colleague's work is substandard, don't do it. You know, just it's too risky for your reputation, and you're the one that's going to get the criticism if it all goes wrong. Legal jobs can involve legal systems from anywhere, actually. I mean, I've recently worked on an infanticide case, interpreting case in court, which involved an African defendant, and I had to be pretty familiar with the legal system in this instance in the Congo. I worked on a legal case. I actually went to the Channel Islands and worked on a big money laundering case there. And I had to become familiar in advance of the job with the legal system on Guernsey in the Channel Islands and the legal procedure in court. I was quite interested actually to see that when I went to a job in, I think it was, actually it was a job in Guernsey, that's right, in the Channel Islands, and the court day would always start with a prayer in French, you know, at the front of the court, because obviously it was based on an old French legal system years and years ago. You know, you might need to be aware of the legal system, for example, in the Republic, so in the south of Ireland, which of course is different from in the north of Ireland. Perhaps the Scottish legal system, which is very different from that in England and Wales. So, you know, bear all this in mind when you're about to accept jobs. Just a quick slide there to show you the Scottish legal system. You can see there are courts, lower courts called sheriff courts, which don't exist in England and Wales. I mean, probably the nearest we'd have in the English and Welsh system would be magistrates court. You can see in the Scottish system the most Supreme Court, the most senior court, if you like, is the Supreme Court in England and Wales and in Scotland. So you've got that similarity. The job may involve different types of law, could be criminal law, could be civil law. I do a lot of criminal law work in interpreting, less so in written translation work for some reason or other, more civil law when I'm doing written work. The legal system in question, say in England and Wales, is based on common law, what we call common law. So it's based on cases before this one, precedent cases. Whereas when I'm working in the French system, I'm working in the French legal system based on the Napoleonic Code, which is a set of written rules. So really quite a difference there. Just a sort of jokey slide there for you. So you really need to know all of this before you even embark on your legal jobs. Could be an international law dispute, for example, about fishing rights. There was a big dispute about a year ago, I think, between France and one of the Channel Islands. It might be a job just involving what we call domestic law, so just the law of whatever country you're in at that time. For example, England or Germany, just German law, whatever that law is. It could be, there's quite a lot of work emerging now for legal interpreters and translators in terms of religious or disputes based on religion. And I've mentioned a couple or so, 2 or 3 here. It could be to do with Sharia law, which is law based on the Islamic faith and rules. And, you know, there are actually in the UK Sharia courts dealing with marriage, for example, and disputes about children. Obviously, they don't have status of the courts in England and Wales, but people believing in Sharia law are still using them. It could be a dispute to do with religious matter to do with the Christian faith. So, you know, it could be to do with perhaps ministers and church ministers priests, whatever, who've had disputes with parishioners or whatever. Could be a Jewish law dispute to do with divorce. A Jewish divorce is called a get, G-E-T. And they actually have special hearings within the Jewish faith to deal with these kind of divorces. Again, obviously, the law in England and Wales is paramount, but people of the Jewish faith will go to these courts, Jewish courts as well. Very different type of legal interpreting could be to do with military courts, post marshals, where you're dealing with perhaps a soldier in the armed forces who considers they've been unfairly dismissed or bullied or sexually harassed. So that is a very different brand of law. And again, you might get interpreting and or translation work to do with one of those kind of cases. So you've got to be very familiar, not only with the terminology, but also with the procedure if you're actually attending court. Might be quite interesting if it's a criminal case, for example, and it's a specific type of case relating to a specific branch of the criminal law. For example, it might just be a subheading within a main branch, say fraud is your main branch of criminal law, but it's a specific offence of money laundering. So basically washing money to make it clean, maybe making money in prostitution, dealing with weapons or whatever, selling them. And then the money is all kind of whitewashed through legitimate businesses. That's what we call money laundering. I had a really interesting legal interpreting case to do with money laundering many years ago, and it involved about 7 defendants, and every single defendant had their own interpreter, because we had to keep them all completely separate so that they couldn't, pass information back and forwards to each other, and the interpreters couldn't contaminate any of the evidence by picking up words and phrases from one that, in conferences with barristers and so on, that might not have been already known to the other defendants. We had to keep completely, in our separate boxes, if you like, throughout. It's about a month-long hearing. The job may involve, as I've said, knowledge of more than one legal system. And this is quite a tricky example of a job that I had a while back, where the client was a British national living in France at the time when he died. He'd already made a will, but in Scotland, because he was of Scottish origin, and all his heirs, the people he was leaving his estate to, his property to, all lived in England. He had his dwelling house in France, and that was going to be sold to pay off the heirs in England. And of course, the sale was going to be dealt with under French property law. So I really had to familiarize myself actually with Scottish law and Scottish legal terminology, because I just was really not familiar with it. I was fine with the French and English systems, obviously. The job may contain non-equivalency legal issues and concepts. An example here, classic example really, is traditional marriage, which is not recognised in England and Wales, but is, for example, in certain African countries such as the Congo. And a question here for you, please put answers in the chat. How and to what extent should the legal translator or interpreter explain non-equivalency issues if they arise? Do you think it's our responsibility, or should we just leave those well alone and just say, okay, well, I'm not the lawyer here. I'm just going to literally interpret the phrase traditional marriage. I'm not going to tell anybody that it's not legal in England and Wales. Jobs may contain cultural terms where a choice has to be made from several meanings depending on the context. And here is where the legal interpreter particularly has to be really, really careful. Your client in court may well describe his or her brother, and you really have to try and work out from the context, are we talking here about their blood brother, maybe their cousin, because they always call in their culture their brother their cousin, their friend? Are they talking about just about a friend that they grew up with? Are they talking about somebody in their church congregation, maybe one of the brothers? Or are they talking about a religious person, a monk, known as Brother Michael or Jean or whoever he is? And again, question for the chat maybe, to what extent should the legal translator or interpreter explain these kind of cultural differences? Again, is it our responsibility? Working into and out of legal English, frankly, we need to these days check carefully what is meant by legal English and by the client in question. Does the client want British English or American English, maybe? And if they're asking for a native English or a mother tongue English legal interpreter, or even a first language English legal interpreter, what do they mean by any of those expressions anyway? You might need to check out with the client what it is they want. And this is going to be really important because, if they're wanting, say, American English, you're going to have to be very careful if you take such a job on that you're no longer talking about cars, you're talking about automobiles and so on. And obviously the American legal system is entirely different from the system here here I say is where I am in the UK. An example of US legal English here, the lawyer is called not a lawyer or a solicitor. I mean, I'm a qualified solicitor. The lawyer here in this slide is called an attorney. So, really basic issues like that are going to hit you. American or British English term could be the same, actually, such as lawsuit, case, so could be used in both legal systems. Not always different, be aware of that. Translating into and out of whose legal English, spelling issues can arise. In the UK, we'll talk about employment law, whereas in America, they'll be talking about labor law and using different spellings for labor as well. So, this all has to be taken into consideration. And precision over general meaning. And I'm going to stop in a minute for some questions and comments, but I just want to finish on this because this is so important for legal interpreters and translators. How precise do we really have to be? Can't we just speak more generally? And the example I give you here, number one, is to do with clarity, is where the phrase you may have to interpret or translate is the company was in debt. But actually, if you've done your legal terminology training and so on, you would be able to improve on that and say the company was insolvent. If you were talking about an individual, if you've done your legal terminology training, you would not say the individual was insolvent, you would say the individual was bankrupt, so it's different as that. And we need to be very aware of redundancy where perhaps we're using unnecessarily excess words, too many words. The phrase that we need to interpret or translate is the claimant was in debt, so the court made an order against him. But, we've done our homework, so we can just say the court made a bankruptcy order, okay? So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop speaking, and I would like to come over to you for your questions and comments, if any. I'm sure there will be. And are there any questions or comments in the chat? I can't see any. I'm sure there must be. I'm sure somebody must have some comments or questions. got 15 people. Yes, Natasha, please. I have a question if no one else does. Yes, go for it. What is it? Just type it in. Oh, yeah. Would you recommend legal courses or training to us? And how do you keep on top of new terminology? Yeah. And Natasha's actually telling us that she is a diploma in public service interpreting student. Okay, so we've got a number of questions there. Actually, the terminology question is from EM. So I think I know who EM is actually. So let's talk about legal training first and CPD. If you don't already have a legal background, such as a law degree maybe, or maybe you're already a qualified lawyer of some sort of variety, it is absolutely essential that you do CPD on a regular basis. And I mean, you know, almost every week, try and attend some kind of legal webinar, or even think about doing if you're in the UK, or even if you're not, it doesn't really matter, but you perhaps want to know about the UK system, consider doing a diploma in public service interpreting in the law pathway. And that way that you will keep up your skills, or even develop them. I'm really, really worried about legal interpreters and translators who are going into jobs and just sort of assuming they know, for example, the difference between burglary and robbery, and they are different. And what is happening in the UK and has been happening for quite a while is that many of the agencies are just sending people into legal jobs, particularly court interpreting jobs, who don't have any sort of legal interpreting and or legal translation knowledge, and they are really putting not only themselves but their clients at risk. You know, recently when I interpreted, for example, in an infanticide case where a mother had allegedly murdered a baby, I had to interpret a great long spiel at the beginning of the case, explaining what she was, you know, what she'd been charged with. And frankly, if I hadn't done my homework on what makes up the infanticide offence, I would have been really in difficulty. I'd have been struggling. So, you know, that's very important that you do keep up with terminology. You can always access good legal terminology webinars, for example, via the Chartered Institute of Linguists, via the Association of Interpreters and Translators, both based in the UK. And obviously, if you're in a different legal system, get recommendations from your professional organizations. I would be very wary of just signing up for courses that are delivered by trainers who have no legal background, because I think some of those are dangerous. I mean, I've actually had some students coming to me and showing me the notes that they've been given on some of these courses, and I've actually had to correct them because I can tell even from the first paragraph that they've been written by people who do not have legal backgrounds, and some of them have actually kind of mixed up the law in England and Wales, for example, with that in America or even other jurisdictions, and the trainer obviously just doesn't know any different. Do go on to, for example, Twitter and look at the Secret Legal Interpreter tweets. They're quite instructive. And also have a look at the Secret Barrister tweets. Both of those are anonymous people. They don't provide their name, but both of them are very rich tweeters in legal terminology. So that's quite an easy way of keeping up with you know, current legal terminology. Do sign up to all kinds of newsletters that you can get for free online. I get quite a lot of newsletters in a field that I interpret for a lot, which is to do with immigration and asylum, from organizations like the Refugee Council, the Free Movement Organization. I mean, as I said in the spiel in the run-up to the questions and answers, you really need to be very competent in the particular branch of law that you are interpreting in or translating in. For example, I don't do any patent law. That again is very, very specialized. So you would need to go to patent translators and interpreters and get information from them. Always try and get recommendations from colleagues who are already in that, well-respected colleagues who are already in those areas. What else can I say about keeping on top of terminology? I mean, the trouble is it never ends. You can never sit back and think, oh, great, I've done all these years or weeks, months of research, and okay, so I know it all. Things in law change all the time. I mean, we've recently had, for example, in the UK, within the last few years anyway, the Modern Slavery Act. There's a lot of work to do with modern slavery cases. Even much more recently than that, just within the last month or so, we've had sections of the Illegal Immigration Act being brought into force. So those of us who work in that sort of area really need to know our stuff in that. So in that specific area. So watch the news. I'm a great believer in listening as well, not just reading resources. Watch the news. What is happening in your parliament at any one time. Keep Excel sheets updated with all new legal terminology that you're hearing. Make sure that you understand it. Any more questions or comments? No? Anybody have any answers to the questions that I was asking about cultural equivalence and how much explanation should we give about legal or cultural equivalence, such as traditional marriage? I think was one of my examples. I mean, just to finish off, I would say, personally, my view on explaining these issues in your written translation, or maybe in your legal venue if you're an interpreter, is to be very careful, because you could have a number of possibilities. A, your explanation might be wrong if you haven't properly researched it. You think maybe that you understand the what is traditional marriage, but actually maybe you don't. Also, you could have a situation where what you're saying, you think it means, is different from what the client thinks it means. You could also be saying far too much, in the sense that you're now giving information to your client about a legal concept that the client didn't know until you gave it to them. And this could also cause issues with their evidence, because they then start using what they've been told by you. So if you're a translator, keep it very brief as well. Don't write a whole essay of footnotes about what traditional marriage is, because you could be actually going over the borderline of the legal translator's role. You could be going into more of a kind of role of a lawyer. Eugenia says here, I think that whilst it is not our responsibility, it could be helpful to point out that there are differences. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I've actually done that, Eugenia, in court, and actually added on to that. Would the lawyers like to expand on that? And then that way I'm basically transferring the actual explanation duty to the lawyers. Or, you can actually ask the judge if the lawyers would like to say something at this point, whether or not the lawyers know. I mean, often our situation is that as the legal interpreter in court, we're the only people that know about this, and the client maybe does or maybe doesn't, and we're pretty much on our own in this field. So it's a huge responsibility, I think. So we're coming to the end of our time together. If anybody would like to contact me, please do. You can find me on LinkedIn, and certainly if you would like any mentoring help for the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting Law exam, I'd be very happy to hear from you. Or maybe you just need some help preparing legal English. I mentor quite a lot of even lawyers actually who need help with legal English. So I'm going to end this session now. Thank you very much, everybody who's attended, and I hope you found it really useful and enjoy the rest of the show. Bye-bye from Romania.